The November morning in 2023 broke cold and silent over Boulder, Colorado, the kind of crystalline dawn where every sound carries for miles and the Rocky Mountains stand sharp against a sky so blue it seems artificial. Detective Rachel Martinez had been awake since 4 a.m., rehearsing the words she would say when she knocked on the door of the modest ranch house on Mapleton Avenue, where 76-year-old Dr. William Ashford had lived for the past 38 years as one of Boulder's most respected pediatricians. At 6:15 a.m., 6 unmarked vehicles from the Boulder Police Department pulled quietly into position around the house, their exhaust creating small clouds of vapor in the freezing air. Martinez stepped out carrying a folder that contained a DNA analysis 17 months in the making. 17 months of following a trail that had gone cold in 1979 when she was still 6 years from being born. Dr. William Ashford was in his kitchen preparing his morning coffee when the knock came. He answered wearing a cardigan sweater and reading glasses, looking exactly like what he was supposed to be, a gentle elderly physician enjoying retirement. "William Ashford," Martinez said, her badge extended. "You're under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Morgan." The name hung in the cold mountain air like a ghost finally given permission to speak. Rebecca Morgan had been 17 years old when she vanished from a Halloween party in Boulder on October 31st, 1979, 44 years ago this very month. For over 4 decades, her disappearance had been Boulder's most haunting, unsolved mystery, transforming her family into tireless advocates for missing persons across Colorado. The arrest of Dr. William Ashford, the man who had delivered Rebecca's younger brother, Daniel, 8 years after her murder, who had been the Morgan family's trusted pediatrician for over 2 decades, who had sent handwritten sympathy cards every October 31st expressing his hope that the family would find peace, would force this university town of 100,000 to confront a betrayal more disturbing than anyone had imagined possible. What made Ashford's decades of deception even more chilling were the details that would emerge during the investigation. He had been one of the volunteer searchers who'd combed Boulder Creek for Rebecca's body in November 1979, had stood beside her grieving father Thomas, calling her name into the darkness, had offered his medical expertise to help investigators understand what might have happened to her. In 1987, when Margaret Morgan was 8 months pregnant and experiencing complications, Ashford had been the on-call pediatrician who delivered her son Daniel at Boulder Community Hospital, had handed the baby to Thomas with words the family would never forget. "He's perfect. Rebecca would have loved him." That statement, which the Morgans had treasured for 36 years as evidence of Ashford's compassionate nature and his continued remembrance of their lost daughter, would be revealed as something far darker, the satisfaction of a killer inserting himself into the life that continued in Rebecca's absence, observing the impact of his crime from the most intimate possible proximity. Over the following decades, Ashford had maintained his connection to the Morgan family through Daniel's routine pediatric care, birthday cards for major milestones, and his presence at community events where the Morgan family advocated for missing persons cases. He had attended the 20th anniversary memorial service for Rebecca in 1999, where Thomas Morgan had publicly thanked the doctors and community members who never forgot Rebecca and continued to support our family through decades of uncertainty. Ashford had stood in the back of the church, his face composed in what attendees interpreted as respectful grief, applauding when the Morgan family announced the establishment of the Rebecca Morgan Environmental Scholarship for Colorado high school students pursuing careers in ecology and environmental science. He had even donated $5,000 to the scholarship fund, a contribution featured in the Boulder Daily Camera under the headline, "Local Pediatrician Honors Memory of Missing Boulder Teen." Most disturbing of all, Ashford had maintained a ritual that would horrify investigators when they finally uncovered it. He ran past Rebecca's burial site 3 mornings a week during his regular jogs in the Roosevelt National Forest, a 5-mile loop he'd established shortly after her murder and maintained for 44 years. Neighbors who'd jogged with Ashford over the years would tell police he often listened to audiobooks during these runs with a particular preference for medical ethics texts and philosophical works about moral responsibility. The image of Dr. Ashford running past the grave of a girl he'd murdered while listening to lectures about the Hippocratic Oath would become, for Boulder residents, the defining symbol of his capacity for psychological compartmentalization and the performance of normalcy that had allowed him to hide in plain sight for nearly half a century. Before we reveal how a breakthrough in forensic genealogy and mitochondrial DNA analysis finally connected Dr. Ashford to Rebecca's murder through a single hair she'd clutched in her hand during her final moments, and how one detective's refusal to accept that some cases were unsolvable would expose the most trusted pediatrician in Boulder as the monster who'd haunted the Morgan family for 44 years. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel brings you cold cases that demonstrate how justice can arrive even after decades of silence, how modern forensic science is rewriting criminal investigation, and how killers who believed they'd successfully hidden behind professional credentials are finally being exposed by technology they never imagined would exist. What you're about to discover about how Dr. Ashford evaded capture while building a medical practice that touched thousands of Boulder families will fundamentally change how you think about trust, professional authority, and the masks that predators wear. Rebecca Lynn Morgan was born on March 14, 1962, to Thomas and Margaret Morgan in their two-story home in the Table Mesa neighborhood of Boulder, the first of what would eventually be 3 children in a family that represented the best of Colorado mountain community values: education, outdoor activity, environmental consciousness, and genuine civic engagement. Her father worked as a civil engineer for the city of Boulder, designing water treatment systems and flood control infrastructure that would protect the town through decades of rapid growth. Her mother taught English literature at Boulder High School, where Rebecca would eventually become one of her students in a senior year AP class that colleagues described as simultaneously awkward and beautiful, watching Margaret Morgan teach her own daughter with the same rigor and high expectations she brought to every student. From early childhood, Rebecca displayed an intensity of focus that marked everything she pursued. When she became interested in something, she committed completely, with a determination that sometimes worried her parents, but more often filled them with pride. At age 9, she decided she wanted to understand how plants grew, so she spent an entire summer creating detailed botanical drawings of every species in the family's backyard, labeling them with Latin names she'd learned from library books, and creating a classification system that impressed her 4th grade teacher enough to submit it to a regional science fair where Rebecca won 2nd place. At 12, she became fascinated by astronomy and spent 6 months saving allowance money to buy a telescope, then spent hundreds of hours creating sky maps and attempting to photograph celestial objects with a camera she'd modified using instructions from a correspondence course with an amateur astronomy club in Denver. By 15, Rebecca's intense focus had shifted to environmental science and the emerging field of ecology, which in the late 1970s was just beginning to gain mainstream recognition beyond academic circles. The Boulder that Rebecca grew up in had long been a center for environmental consciousness, home to the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and a population that included both university professors studying climate and atmospheric science and counterculture refugees from the 1960s who'd settled in Colorado seeking alternative lifestyles closer to nature. But Rebecca's approach to environmental issues went beyond the casual recycling and organic food preferences common in Boulder. She organized Boulder High School's first environmental club during her junior year, led campaigns to reduce cafeteria waste and implement composting programs, and spent weekends volunteering with the Colorado Environmental Coalition, where she'd become their youngest regular participant in legislative advocacy efforts at age 16. Her junior year biology teacher, David Chen, would later tell investigators that Rebecca possessed the most analytically precise mind I'd encountered in 20 years of teaching, coupled with a passion that drove her to action rather than just contemplation. Her senior project, completed in spring 1979, analyzed water quality in Boulder Creek using chemical testing methods she'd taught herself from university-level textbooks, producing results rigorous enough to be cited in a Colorado Department of Health report on front-range watershed management. She had been accepted to Colorado State University's Environmental Science program with a partial scholarship, planning to start in fall 1980 after taking a gap year to work and save money for expenses the scholarship didn't cover. Her bedroom walls were covered not with posters of rock bands, but with topographical maps of Colorado wilderness areas, photographs of endangered species, and hand-drawn charts tracking pollution levels in local waterways. The Boulder that Rebecca knew in October 1979 was a town of approximately 75,000 residents, split between the university population that swelled and contracted with academic semesters and the permanent residents who'd chosen Boulder for its combination of outdoor recreation, intellectual culture, and proximity to Denver's job market. The University of Colorado Boulder dominated the town's eastern side, its distinctive sandstone buildings and red tile roofs creating a campus that looked more Mediterranean than Rocky Mountain. The downtown Pearl Street Mall, converted to a pedestrian zone just 2 years earlier in 1977, had become the social heart of Boulder, a 4-block stretch of shops, restaurants, and street performers that attracted locals and tourists drawn by Boulder's reputation as Colorado's quirky, progressive mountain town. Halloween 1979 fell on a Wednesday, which meant Boulder High School held classes as usual, but the evening belonged to parties scattered across residential neighborhoods. Rebecca had planned to attend a gathering at her friend Sarah Mitchell's house on College Avenue, a party of approximately 30 Boulder High seniors that Sarah's parents had reluctantly agreed to host with strict rules about no alcohol and a midnight curfew. Rebecca left her house at 7:30 p.m., wearing jeans, a burgundy sweater her grandmother had knit for her birthday, and carrying a small backpack containing her wallet, keys, and a paperback copy of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson that she was rereading for the third time, the book's margins filled with her notes and observations about how Carson's arguments applied to current Colorado environmental challenges. Margaret Morgan would remember for 44 years that Rebecca had seemed preoccupied that evening, distracted in a way that wasn't typical for her intensely focused daughter. When Margaret asked if everything was okay, Rebecca had said, "I think I'm finally going to be able to make a real difference, Mom. Not just talk about problems, but actually solve one." When pressed for details, Rebecca had been vague, mentioning something about meeting someone who could help her with the project, but declining to elaborate. Margaret, accustomed to Rebecca's environmental activism and assuming this referred to some school-related initiative, hadn't pushed further. That decision would haunt her for the rest of her life, according to witnesses interviewed extensively after Rebecca's disappearance. She arrived at Sarah Mitchell's party around 8:15 p.m., stayed for approximately 90 minutes talking with friends about college plans and environmental issues, and declined offers of beer that several students had smuggled in despite the no alcohol rules. At 9:47 p.m., a time precisely documented because Sarah checked the clock, worried that Rebecca leaving early might somehow reflect poorly on the party, Rebecca told Sarah she needed to leave because she had to meet someone about something important and would try to return later if the meeting didn't take too long. She walked out the front door into the October cold, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her breath visible in air that had dropped to near freezing. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Morgan alive. When Rebecca hadn't returned home by 11 p.m., Margaret Morgan called Sarah Mitchell's house, where Sarah's increasingly panicked explanation that Rebecca had left over an hour ago triggered the kind of parental fear that moves from concern to terror in seconds. Thomas Morgan immediately drove the route between the Mitchell house and their home, searching streets that were mostly empty now that Halloween activities had wound down and Boulder's early-to-bed culture had reasserted itself. By 11:30 p.m., Thomas had driven the route 3 times, checking parking lots and side streets, his panic growing with each empty intersection. At midnight, when Rebecca still hadn't appeared and wasn't answering the emergency pager her parents had given her for exactly this kind of situation, Thomas Morgan called the Boulder Police Department to report his daughter missing. The dispatcher who took Thomas Morgan's call at 12:17 a.m. on November the 1st noted that Rebecca was 17 years old, had left a party voluntarily, and had been gone less than 3 hours. But something in Thomas's voice, a quality the dispatcher would describe decades later as the sound of someone who knows in their bones that something is fundamentally wrong, prompted her to send a patrol unit immediately, rather than waiting for morning. Officer David Henderson arrived at 12:47 a.m. and conducted an interview with Thomas and Margaret Morgan that transformed his assessment from probably fine teenager to potential emergency situation within minutes. The Morgans explained that Rebecca wasn't impulsive, didn't keep secrets from her parents about her general whereabouts, and had seemed genuinely preoccupied that evening in a way that now terrified Margaret in retrospect. Most concerning was Rebecca's statement about meeting someone about something important, a vague explanation that suggested plans she'd deliberately kept from her parents. Officer Henderson immediately radioed for additional units and began organizing a search of the area between Sarah Mitchell's house and the Morgan residence, a distance of approximately 2 miles through residential neighborhoods that should have been a straightforward walk, but which offered numerous side streets, parks, and the Boulder Creek path where something could have happened without witnesses. The search for Rebecca Morgan began in earnest at 2 a.m. on November 1st, 1979, and would eventually involve over 200 volunteers, multiple search and rescue teams, and a level of community mobilization that Boulder had never experienced. The Boulder Police Department, led by Detective James Sullivan, a 23-year veteran, established a command center at the Morgan home and began systematically canvassing every possible route. Search dogs picked up Rebecca's scent along College Avenue, heading south toward Pearl Street, then lost the trail in the parking lot behind the Boulder Theater, a location that would become crucial to understanding what had happened during those missing hours. The loss of scent in a parking lot suggested Rebecca had either entered a vehicle there or had been met by someone who'd altered her planned route. Detective Sullivan's investigation quickly focused on reconstructing Rebecca's activities and state of mind in the days before her disappearance, searching for clues about what important meeting she'd referenced. Interviews with Rebecca's friends revealed that she'd been somewhat withdrawn during the week before Halloween, spending more time alone and less engaged in her usual social activities. Her best friend, Amanda Pierce, mentioned that Rebecca had seemed excited on the afternoon of October 30th, had said something about finally getting proof that would make people pay attention, but hadn't elaborated despite Amanda's questions about what she meant. This statement triggered Sullivan's investigative instincts. A search of Rebecca's bedroom, conducted with the Morgan's permission, produced her journal, a detailed record kept in neat handwriting that would become crucial evidence. The entries from October 1979 revealed that Rebecca had been investigating what she suspected was illegal dumping of industrial waste in a remote area of the foothills west of Boulder. She had discovered the site during a solo hike in September, had noticed discolored vegetation and chemical odors that seemed inconsistent with natural processes, and had returned multiple times to collect water and soil samples that she'd been testing using borrowed equipment from the Boulder High Chemistry Lab and methods she'd learned from university textbooks. The journal entries documented her growing conviction that she'd discovered evidence of serious environmental crimes. October 15th. Test results show heavy metals way above background levels. This isn't natural. Someone is dumping industrial waste in the national forest. October 22nd. Collected more samples from 3 different spots, all showing contamination. Need to figure out who to report this to. EPA, State Environmental Agency. October 28th. Talk to Mr. Chen about what I'm finding. He says I need professional help interpreting the results before going to authorities. Suggested talking to someone with medical chemistry background who could verify my methodology. The journal's final entry, dated October 30th, 1979, one day before Rebecca disappeared, contained words that would haunt the investigation for 44 years. Dr. Ashford from the community clinic says he can help. Told him about my water testing and he was really interested. He has contacts at the state health department and says he knows the right people to make sure this gets investigated properly. Meeting him tomorrow night, Halloween, after Sarah's party so he can look at my samples and results. He's going to drive me to the site so I can show him exactly where I collected everything. Finally feels like I'm doing something real instead of just talking. This could actually stop whoever's poisoning the forest. The identification of Dr. Ashford as Rebecca's planned meeting became the investigation's immediate focus. Margaret Morgan, when shown the journal entry, remembered that Rebecca had been volunteering at the Boulder Community Health Clinic downtown, where several local doctors donated time providing free medical care to uninsured residents. A call to the clinic confirmed that Dr. William Ashford, a pediatrician who'd recently established his practice in Boulder after completing his residency in Denver, was one of the regular volunteers. Rebecca had worked reception desk shifts at the clinic on several Saturday mornings, where she'd have had opportunities to interact with Ashford and other medical staff. Dr. Ashford was contacted on November 3rd, 1979, just 3 days after Rebecca's disappearance, and agreed to come to the police station for an interview. He presented as cooperative, concerned, and genuinely shocked by the news that Rebecca was missing. The interview, documented in case files that Detective Martinez would review 44 years later, showed Ashford carefully constructing an account that contained just enough truth to be believable, while omitting the crucial details that would have identified him as Rebecca's killer. Ashford confirmed that Rebecca had volunteered at the clinic and that he'd spoken with her on several occasions about her environmental interests. He acknowledged that Rebecca had approached him on October 30th with questions about chemical contamination and health impacts, had shown him some water testing results she'd conducted, and had asked whether he knew who she should contact about potential illegal dumping. Ashford stated he'd suggested she contact the Colorado Department of Health rather than the EPA, had offered general encouragement about her environmental work, but crucially denied having made any specific plans to meet with her on October 31st. I told her I'd be happy to look at her results sometime if she wanted a second opinion on her methodology, Ashford told Detective Sullivan, but we didn't set up a specific meeting. I assumed she'd bring the information to the clinic next time she volunteered, which would have been the following Saturday, November 3rd. His alibi for Halloween evening was straightforward and would be corroborated by his wife, Eleanor. They'd been home together preparing to hand out candy to trick-or-treaters, though they'd had surprisingly few visitors due to the cold weather and most families concentrating their activities in other neighborhoods. Ashford stated they'd put out the porch light around 9:30 p.m. When it became clear no more children were coming, had watched television for an hour and had gone to bed around 10:30 p.m. Eleanor Ashford, interviewed separately the same day, provided an account that matched her husband's in every detail. Detective Sullivan found nothing in Ashford's demeanor or statements that raised suspicion. The doctor seemed genuinely concerned about Rebecca's welfare, offered to help with the search efforts in any way possible, and presented as exactly what he appeared to be, a dedicated young physician who'd had brief professional interactions with a missing teenager through their mutual volunteer work at a community health clinic. Sullivan noted in his case file, Dr. Ashford cooperative and forthcoming, no indicators of deception. Account corroborated by spouse, no apparent connection to victim beyond casual acquaintance through clinic volunteering. Recommend follow-up only if additional evidence suggests relevance. What Detective Sullivan had no way of knowing, what the investigative tools and forensic capabilities of 1979 couldn't reveal, was that Dr. William Ashford had been lying about every substantive detail of his final interaction with Rebecca Morgan. He had indeed arranged to meet her on Halloween evening at 9:45 p.m. in the parking lot behind the Boulder Theater, a location chosen specifically because it would be relatively empty after downtown trick-or-treating activities concluded. He had told Rebecca he wanted to drive to the suspected dumping site in daylight, but that an evening meeting would allow them to plan the visit and review her methodology so he could help her prepare a proper report for state health officials. Rebecca, trusting a physician who volunteered at the same community clinic where she worked and who seemed genuinely supportive of her environmental research, had agreed to the meeting despite its unusual timing. The truth that would remain hidden for 44 years was that Dr. William Ashford's interest in Rebecca had nothing to do with environmental contamination or water testing methodology. He had been watching her at the clinic for weeks, had become obsessed with her intensity and intelligence in the way she moved through the world with such focused purpose. The offer to help with her research had been a calculated manipulation, a pretense to create an opportunity to get her alone. When Rebecca met him in the parking lot at 9:45 p.m. and climbed into his 1977 Volvo sedan, she believed she was about to take a significant step toward exposing environmental crimes and protecting Colorado wilderness. Instead, she had approximately 30 minutes left to live. Ashford drove not toward the foothills where Rebecca believed they were heading, but in the opposite direction, taking back roads that led away from populated areas. When Rebecca realized they weren't going to the dumping site and questioned where they were going, Ashford's carefully maintained facade finally cracked. The struggle that followed would end with Rebecca Morgan strangled to death with Ashford's bare hands in the front seat of his Volvo, her final conscious act clutching desperately at her killer's hair and pulling several strands free, strands that would remain clenched in her hand through her burial, and 44 years of decomposition waiting for mitochondrial DNA technology that wouldn't exist for decades. Ashford drove Rebecca's body to a location he'd scouted during his regular jogging routes in the Roosevelt National Forest, a remote ravine approximately 12 miles west of Boulder, accessible only by rough Forest Service roads. He buried her in a shallow grave, covering her body with rocks and forest debris, then drove back to Boulder, arriving home at 11:30 p.m. When Eleanor asked why he was so late, he explained he'd been called to the hospital for an emergency consultation with a patient whose parents were concerned about unusual symptoms. Eleanor, accustomed to the irregular hours of medical practice, accepted this explanation without question. Ashford showered thoroughly, carefully cleaning under his fingernails and washing his hair multiple times, then went to sleep beside his wife, while Rebecca Morgan lay in a grave 12 miles away, and her parents began the frantic search that would consume the rest of their lives. The next morning, when news of Rebecca's disappearance spread through Boulder's tight-knit community, Dr. Ashford was among the first volunteers to join the search efforts. He spent 8 hours over 3 days helping comb Boulder Creek and the foothills trails, standing beside Thomas Morgan and calling Rebecca's name into the wilderness, offering his medical expertise to help investigators understand what might have happened to her. The performance was so convincing, the mask so perfect, that it never occurred to anyone, including Detective Sullivan, that the concerned physician volunteering his time might be the person responsible for Rebecca's disappearance. As November gave way to December with no trace of Rebecca, the case began its slow descent into cold case status. Detective Sullivan continued following leads, investigating the illegal dumping angle Rebecca had been researching and pursuing hundreds of tips that led nowhere. The dumping site Rebecca had discovered turned out to be real. Later investigation revealed it was the work of a defunct mining operation that had been improperly disposing of processing waste, but there was no evidence connecting those responsible to Rebecca's disappearance. Sullivan interviewed dozens of people, constructed elaborate timelines, and generated case files that would eventually fill 6 bankers' boxes, but without Rebecca's body or physical evidence connecting anyone to her disappearance, the investigation stalled. What no one could have anticipated was that Dr. William Ashford would spend the next 44 years methodically inserting himself into the Morgan family's ongoing tragedy, using his position as a trusted pediatrician to maintain proximity to the family whose daughter he'd murdered. When Margaret Morgan became pregnant in 1986, her obstetrician recommended Dr. Ashford as Boulder's most respected pediatrician for the delivery and subsequent care. The Ashfords and Morgans had been acquaintances through community events, and Margaret knew William as the kind doctor who'd volunteered to search for Rebecca, who still asked how the family was coping during chance encounters at the grocery store, who sent sympathy cards every October 31st. The delivery of Daniel Morgan on March 8, 1987, was handled by Dr. Ashford during an overnight shift at Boulder Community Hospital. The photograph taken moments after birth, preserved in the Morgan family albums, shows Ashford holding newborn Daniel, while Thomas and Margaret look on with expressions mixing joy at their son's arrival with the perpetual grief of Rebecca's absence. "He's perfect," Ashford told the Morgans. "Rebecca would have loved being a big sister to him." Those words, which Thomas and Margaret treasured as evidence of how their community continued to honor Rebecca's memory, were the ultimate expression of Ashford's narcissistic need to observe the impact of his crime from the most intimate proximity possible. Over the following decades, Ashford maintained his role as Daniel's pediatrician through routine checkups, vaccinations, and the inevitable childhood illnesses. He attended Rebecca Morgan memorial events, contributed to the scholarship fund established in her name, and built a pediatric practice that touched thousands of Boulder families, while maintaining the terrible secret that would have destroyed everything he'd constructed. The performance was so complete, the compartmentalization so absolute, that even when forensic technology evolved enough to solve decades-old cold cases through DNA analysis, even when other predators who'd hidden in plain sight began being exposed through genetic genealogy, Ashford never seriously believed he would be caught. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, because Rebecca's story resonates across every community that's had to confront how professional credentials and community standing can mask unimaginable evil, and how the people we trust most completely with our children's lives might be hiding secrets that would shatter our understanding of reality itself. The investigation that would finally expose Dr. William Ashford had been set in motion in March 2022, when Detective Rachel Martinez, newly assigned to Boulder Police Department's Cold Case Unit, began systematically reviewing unsolved disappearances with the specific goal of identifying cases that might benefit from advanced forensic technologies that hadn't existed when the crimes were originally investigated. The case of Rebecca Morgan, missing for 43 years with no body recovered and no viable suspects despite extensive investigation, represented exactly the kind of challenge Martinez had been trained to tackle using genealogical DNA analysis, advanced mitochondrial DNA sequencing, and digital reconstruction of evidence that had been collected but never properly analyzed due to technological limitations. What Martinez discovered in the evidence boxes from the Rebecca Morgan investigation would change everything. A single human hair, carefully preserved in a paper envelope labeled "Recovered from victim's right hand. Scene processing 11/15/79, Roosevelt National Forest." That date, November 15, 1979, was 2 weeks after Rebecca's disappearance, and marked the day when hunters had stumbled across her shallow grave while tracking elk through the remote ravine. The hair had been noted in the original evidence logs, but never analyzed beyond basic visual microscopy, which in 1979 could determine color and general characteristics, but couldn't extract the genetic information that would identify whose head it had come from. That hair clutched in Rebecca's hand during her final moments as she fought desperately against the person strangling her, had been waiting 43 years to tell its story. Detective Martinez would ensure it finally had the chance to speak. Detective Rachel Martinez had been with the Boulder Police Department for 11 years when she was assigned to the cold case unit in March 2022. But it was the Rebecca Morgan case that would define her career and test everything she'd learned about persistence, forensic science, and the psychological complexities of killers who hide in plain sight for decades. The assignment came from Cold Case Unit Commander David Chen, the same David Chen who had been Rebecca's biology teacher in 1979 and who had spent 43 years carrying the weight of wondering whether he could have done something different, asked different questions, noticed warning signs that might have prevented Rebecca from walking into a trap she never saw coming. "I want you to look at Rebecca's case with fresh eyes," Chen told Martinez during their first meeting in March 2022. "New technology, new databases, new ways of analyzing evidence that didn't exist in 1979. If there's any chance of finally giving the Morgan family answers, I need you to find it." Martinez began by spending 3 weeks doing nothing but reading, systematically working through 6 bankers' boxes containing every document, photograph, witness statement, and evidence log generated during the original investigation and sporadic follow-ups over 4 decades. She read Detective Sullivan's meticulously detailed case notes, studied crime scene photographs from the Roosevelt National Forest location where Rebecca's body had been discovered on November 15, 1979, and reviewed interviews with over 200 people who'd been questioned during the initial investigation. What emerged from this deep immersion was a portrait of a bright, passionate teenager who'd been killed not by a stranger or random predator, but by someone she'd trusted enough to meet alone after dark, someone who'd used her environmental activism as a lure to get her isolated and vulnerable. The evidence inventory from Rebecca's gravesite yielded the discovery that would change everything. Item 47B, 1 human hair recovered from victim's right hand, color brown, approximately 3 inches length, root sheath present. That final detail, root sheath present, was crucial because it meant the hair had been pulled out rather than naturally shed. And more importantly, for forensic purposes, it meant the root contained cellular material that could potentially yield DNA even after 43 years of burial. Martinez immediately contacted the Boulder Police Department's evidence custodian to locate item 47B and verify its condition and chain of custody documentation. The hair had been preserved in a paper envelope inside a sealed evidence box stored in the climate-controlled facility where Boulder PD maintained evidence from unsolved cases. When Martinez opened the envelope on April 8, 2022, wearing gloves and working in a sterile environment to prevent contamination, she found the hair in remarkably good condition, the root sheath still visible under magnification. Traditional nuclear DNA analysis, which had become standard in criminal investigations by the 1990s, requires relatively large amounts of cellular material and is vulnerable to degradation over time. But mitochondrial DNA analysis, which had advanced significantly in the 2010s and 2020s, could work with much smaller samples and was more resistant to environmental degradation because each cell contains hundreds of mitochondria compared to just 1 nucleus. Martinez submitted the hair to Othram Inc., a private forensic laboratory in Texas that specialized in advanced DNA analysis and forensic genealogy, technologies that had revolutionized cold case investigations by allowing investigators to identify suspects through family tree construction using DNA profiles uploaded to public genealogy databases. The analysis consumed 4 months, during which Martinez continued investigating other aspects of the case, re-interviewing witnesses who were still alive and cognitively able to discuss events from 1979, and using digital tools to reconstruct timelines and geographical patterns that hadn't been possible with the paper-based record-keeping systems available to Detective Sullivan. The results from Othram arrived in Martinez's email on August 12, 2022, with a subject line that read, "Morgan Case. Mitochondrial DNA profile complete." The laboratory had successfully extracted sufficient mitochondrial DNA from the hair's root sheath to generate a profile that could be searched against genealogy databases. More importantly, the profile was complete enough to potentially identify a specific individual if a direct comparison sample could be obtained. The next step was the most challenging, using the mitochondrial DNA profile to construct a family tree that would lead to the person whose hair Rebecca had clutched during her final moments. Forensic genealogy works by uploading an unknown DNA profile to public databases like GED Match, where millions of people have voluntarily uploaded their genetic information for the purpose of finding relatives and exploring their ancestry. When the unknown profile shares sufficient genetic markers with database users, genealogists can identify common ancestors and construct family trees that eventually narrow down to potential suspects. The process can take months and requires extraordinary patience and skill, but it had already solved dozens of cold cases across the United States, most famously the Golden State Killer case in 2018. The forensic genealogist assigned to Rebecca's case, Dr. Barbara Ray Venner, had been instrumental in identifying the Golden State Killer and had become one of the world's leading experts in using DNA and genealogy to solve violent crimes. She began working with the mitochondrial DNA profile from Rebecca's case in September 2022, uploading it to GED Match and other databases under protocols established to balance investigative needs with privacy concerns. The initial results showed several third and fourth cousin matches, distant relatives who shared common ancestors with whoever had left the hair in Rebecca's hand. Ray Venner began the painstaking process of constructing family trees for each match, looking for convergence points where multiple trees connected, indicating potential suspects who descended from those common ancestors. By December 2022, Ray Venner had narrowed the possibilities to 3 extended families, with roots in Colorado and connections to the Boulder area in 1979. Martinez began investigating individuals from those families who would have been adults in 1979 and who had potential connections to Rebecca Morgan. The work was meticulous and time-consuming, requiring verification of ages, locations, and possible interactions with Rebecca through employment, education, or community involvement. 2 of the 3 families yielded no promising leads, their members either too young in 1979, living in other states, or lacking any documented connection to Rebecca or the environmental activism that had drawn her to her killer. The 3rd family, however, produced a name that made Martinez's hands tremble when she saw it in the genealogical report: Ashford. The family tree showed William Eugene Ashford, born March 7, 1947, who would have been 32 years old in October 1979. Martinez pulled up William Ashford's basic biographical information and felt her pulse quicken as the details emerged. Pediatrician, Boulder resident since 1978, volunteered Boulder Community Health Clinic in 1979. She immediately accessed the original case files and found Ashford's name exactly where she should have expected it. Witness interview conducted November 3, 1979, in which Ashford confirmed knowing Rebecca through clinic volunteering but denied having specific plans to meet her on Halloween. The connection between Ashford and the mitochondrial DNA profile wasn't definitive proof. Genetic genealogy could narrow suspects, but required confirmation through direct DNA comparison. But it was enough to transform Ashford from a peripheral witness interviewed once in 1979 to the primary suspect in a murder investigation. Martinez spent the next week conducting background research on Ashford that the original investigation had never pursued because he'd been cleared based on his alibi and lack of suspicious behavior. What she discovered was a pattern that had been invisible in 1979, but which, viewed through the lens of modern understanding about predatory behavior, created a disturbing picture. William Ashford had completed medical school at the University of Colorado in 1973 and his pediatric residency at Denver General Hospital in 1976. He'd worked at a community health clinic in Colorado Springs from 1976 to 1978 before moving to Boulder and establishing his private practice. Martinez contacted the Colorado Springs Police Department and requested any reports involving Ashford during his time there. What came back was a single incident report from March 1978, filed by the parents of a 15-year-old girl who'd been a patient of Ashford's at the community clinic. The parents alleged that Ashford had made their daughter uncomfortable during an examination, had asked inappropriate questions about her social life and relationships, and had suggested she come in for additional appointments without parental supervision. The clinic had investigated the complaint and found no evidence of inappropriate physical contact, but Ashford's employment had been terminated in May 1978 under circumstances described as mutual separation in his personnel file. Martinez recognized the pattern concerning behavior that didn't cross into prosecutable territory, but which had been serious enough to end his employment. Ashford had moved to Boulder shortly afterward, had volunteered at the community health clinic while establishing his private practice, and had been working there when Rebecca Morgan began her Saturday volunteer shifts in summer 1979. The challenge Martinez faced was obtaining a DNA sample from Ashford for direct comparison with the mitochondrial DNA profile from the hair found in Rebecca's hand. Colorado law allowed police to collect DNA samples from suspects only under specific circumstances: consent, search warrant based on probable cause, or after arrest. Approaching Ashford directly and asking for a voluntary sample would alert him that he was under investigation and risk him destroying evidence or fleeing. Obtaining a search warrant required demonstrating probable cause to a judge, which at this stage meant presenting the forensic genealogy evidence and arguing it was sufficient to justify compelled DNA collection. Martinez consulted with Boulder County District Attorney Sarah Morrison, who reviewed the evidence and agreed that the combination of forensic genealogy results, Ashford's documented connection to Rebecca through the clinic, his previous termination in Colorado Springs for concerning behavior, and his presence in Boulder on Halloween 1979 created sufficient probable cause for a search warrant. The warrant was prepared and presented to District Court Judge Robert Hamilton on January 15, 2023, who signed it after reviewing the evidence package Martinez had assembled. The warrant authorized collection of a DNA sample from William Ashford through buccal swab or discarded items containing his genetic material. The decision was made to obtain Ashford's DNA through covert means rather than executing the warrant directly, an investigative technique that had become common in cold case investigations, where authorities wanted to confirm DNA matches before making arrests and potentially alerting suspects. Martinez and Detective James Wilson conducted surveillance on Ashford for 3 days in late January 2023, documenting his routines and looking for opportunities to collect discarded items. On January 23, 2023, they followed Ashford to a Starbucks on Pearl Street where he ordered coffee and a blueberry scone, items he consumed while reading the newspaper at an outdoor table despite the January cold. When Ashford left 20 minutes later, Martinez and Wilson immediately secured the coffee cup and napkins he'd discarded in a trash receptacle, carefully preserving them in evidence bags using sterile gloves to prevent contamination. The items were delivered to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation Laboratory in Denver, where forensic scientists extracted DNA from saliva on the coffee cup rim and buccal cells on the napkins. The DNA profile generated from these samples was compared against the mitochondrial DNA profile from the hair found in Rebecca Morgan's hand 43 years earlier. The match was definitive. William Ashford was the source of the hair Rebecca had clutched during her murder, biological evidence that placed him at the scene during her final moments, in a way that demolished the alibi he'd provided in 1979. Martinez spent the next 8 months building a case that would go beyond the DNA evidence to demonstrate how Ashford had systematically deceived investigators, inserted himself into the Morgan family's tragedy, and maintained his facade for 44 years. She discovered that Ashford had been one of the volunteer searchers who'd combed Boulder Creek in November 1979, had stood beside Thomas Morgan calling Rebecca's name. She found photographs from the 1999 memorial service showing Ashford in attendance, his $5,000 contribution to the Rebecca Morgan Environmental Scholarship featured in the Boulder Daily Camera. Most disturbingly, she discovered through interviews with the Morgan family that Ashford had been Daniel Morgan's pediatrician from birth through age 18, had delivered him at Boulder Community Hospital, and had maintained a relationship with the family for decades. The interview with Margaret Morgan, conducted in May 2023, was one of the most difficult conversations Martinez had ever navigated. Margaret, now 77 years old, had spent 44 years maintaining hope that Rebecca's case would be solved, while simultaneously learning to live with the probability that she would die without answers. When Martinez explained that DNA evidence had identified a suspect and asked whether Margaret knew Dr. William Ashford, the initial response was confusion. "Of course I know Bill Ashford," Margaret said. "He delivered Daniel. He was our pediatrician for years. He's been so kind to our family, always asking how we're doing, sending cards on Rebecca's anniversary. Why are you asking about Bill?" The moment when Martinez revealed that Ashford was the person whose DNA had been found on Rebecca's body was captured on the interview recording and would later be played in court as evidence of the profound psychological impact of Ashford's decades of deception. Margaret's initial reaction was complete disbelief, insisting there must be some mistake, that Bill Ashford was incapable of harming anyone, that he'd been nothing but supportive of their family. But as Martinez walked through the evidence, showed Margaret the DNA analysis results, and explained how forensic genealogy had identified Ashford as the source of the hair Rebecca had pulled from her killer during her final struggle there, Margaret's denial shifted into something else, a kind of horror that came from understanding that the man she'd trusted with her son's health care, the man who'd held newborn Daniel and said Rebecca would have loved him, had been her daughter's murderer all along. He was in our home, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. He examined Daniel. He gave him vaccinations. I made him coffee. Thomas and I sent him Christmas cards. He sent us sympathy cards every year on October 31st, and I thought it showed how much he cared about Rebecca's memory. All this time he knew. He knew where she was. He knew what he'd done, and he stood in our home and looked us in the eyes and pretended to care. The psychological trauma of this realization would require months of therapy for Margaret and would become a central element of the prosecution's case about the extraordinary cruelty of Ashford's decades-long deception. The arrest warrant for William Ashford was signed by Judge Hamilton on September 20th, 2023, charging him with first-degree murder in the death of Rebecca Morgan. The tactical team was assembled with extraordinary care because Martinez and Commander Chen understood that arresting one of Boulder's most respected pediatricians would create shockwaves through the community that would take years to process. The decision was made to execute the arrest at Ashford's home early in the morning before he left for his regular jog, minimizing the risk of public confrontation and giving investigators the opportunity to search the house for evidence while Ashford was in custody. The arrest occurred at 6:15 a.m. on November 2nd, 2023, 44 years and 2 days after Rebecca Morgan's disappearance. When Ashford answered the door and Martinez informed him he was under arrest for Rebecca's murder, his reaction would be described by every officer present as chilling in its lack of genuine surprise. I wondered when this day would come, Ashford said, his voice calm, as if discussing a patient's test results. I've been reading about forensic genealogy solving old cases, the Golden State Killer, the other ones. I knew eventually someone would look at Rebecca's case with new technology. I'm actually impressed it took this long. That statement, made before Ashford's attorney arrived and advised him to stop talking, would become crucial evidence of consciousness of guilt. The fact that Ashford's first response wasn't to deny involvement or express shock at being accused, but rather to acknowledge he'd been anticipating arrest, demonstrated his awareness that evidence existed to connect him to Rebecca's murder. Eleanor Ashford, now 73, had been in the kitchen when police arrested her husband and would tell investigators she'd had no knowledge of William's involvement in Rebecca's death, had believed his 1979 alibi that they'd been home together on Halloween, and was devastated to learn that her entire marriage had been built on a lie she'd unknowingly helped maintain through her corroboration of his alibi. The search of Ashford's home produced evidence that illuminated the psychological compartmentalization that had allowed him to maintain his secret for 44 years. In a locked file cabinet in his home office, investigators found a folder labeled RM, containing newspaper clippings about Rebecca's disappearance and the subsequent investigation, copies of the sympathy cards he'd sent to the Morgan family over decades, and a handwritten journal documenting his feelings about the crime and his strategy for avoiding detection. The journal entries, which spanned from 1980 to 2023, provided an extraordinary window into the mind of someone who'd committed murder and then spent 4 decades constructing a life of respectability while maintaining awareness of his crime. Entry from March 1980. 1 year since I moved to Boulder. The Rebecca situation's behind me. Police have no leads. The body was found, but there's no forensic evidence that can connect to me. I've established myself as a community member who tried to help with the search. Need to continue being visible in community activities related to missing persons issues to maintain the perception that I care about these cases. Entry from March 1987. Delivered Margaret Morgan's baby today. A boy, healthy, 8 lbs, 3 Oz. They named him Daniel. Margaret cried when she saw him, said she wished Rebecca could have met him. Thomas thanked me for everything I've done for their family over the years. Said it means so much that I haven't forgotten Rebecca. The irony's overwhelming, but I maintained appropriate professional demeanor. This level of access to the family provides security. No one would suspect the person they've invited into the most intimate aspects of their lives. Entry from October 1999. Attended Rebecca's 20th anniversary memorial. Contributed $5,000 to the scholarship fund. Public recognition in newspaper reinforces my community standing. The Morgans personally thanked me. Thomas hugged me and said I was an example of the good people who make Boulder special. The performance has become so natural that I sometimes wonder which version of myself is real. Entry from April 2018, Golden State Killer arrested through DNA and genealogy. This technology is concerning. Need to research how it works and whether there's any risk to my situation. The hair Rebecca pulled from my head during the struggle concerns me if they have the technology to extract usable DNA after so many years. Should I consider leaving Boulder? But that might draw attention after 40 years of establishment here. The journal entries demonstrated Ashford's ongoing consciousness of guilt, his deliberate strategy to maintain close contact with the Morgan family as a form of psychological cover, and his awareness that advancing forensic technology posed a threat to his freedom. The prosecution would argue these entries prove not only Ashford's guilt, but the premeditated and calculated nature of his 4-decade deception. The search also produced evidence from Ashford's computer browser history, showing he'd been regularly searching for information about forensic genealogy, following news about cold cases being solved through DNA analysis, and researching the legal standards for genealogical DNA use in criminal investigations. In March 2022, around the time Detective Martinez began reviewing the Rebecca Morgan case, Ashford had searched for Rebecca Morgan Cold Case Boulder and Statute of Limitations Murder Colorado, searches that indicated his awareness that renewed interest in Rebecca's case could pose a threat. Most chilling was the discovery of a USB drive hidden in a false bottom of a drawer in Ashford's office, containing digital photographs he'd taken during his morning jogs in the Roosevelt National Forest. The photos spanned 20 years, from 2003, when digital cameras became common, to 2023, and showed the same location from multiple angles, a rocky ravine with a small clearing where Rebecca Morgan had been buried. The metadata on the photos showed they'd been taken on October 31st of each year, anniversary photos documenting the burial site. Forensic psychologist Dr. Michael Chen, who would later testify at trial, explained that this behavior represented a combination of trophy-taking, ritual commemoration, and narcissistic fascination with the secret that defined Ashford's hidden identity as Rebecca's killer. The community reaction to Ashford's arrest was seismic in a way that exceeded even Martinez's predictions. The Boulder Daily Camera ran a front-page story on November 3, 2023, with the headline, "Beloved Pediatrician Arrested in 1979 Rebecca Morgan Murder." The article included reactions from dozens of Boulder residents, many of whom were former patients of Ashford's or parents of children he'd treated. The common theme was disbelief mixed with horror as people struggled to reconcile the gentle, caring doctor they'd known with the monster who'd murdered a teenager and then spent 44 years hiding behind his medical credentials. Sarah Mitchell, Rebecca's friend who'd hosted the Halloween party in 1979 and who was now 62 years old and living in Denver, told reporters, "I remember Dr. Ashford volunteering to help search for Rebecca. I saw him at the command center, talking to Rebecca's father, offering to help in any way he could. All this time he knew. He knew she wasn't missing, knew she was dead, knew where her body was. I've spent 44 years wondering if there was something I could have done differently that night, some way I could have stopped Rebecca from leaving the party. And the answer is that yes, I could have. If I'd known that the kind doctor volunteering to help find her was actually the person who'd killed her, I would have warned her. But how do you warn someone about a respected pediatrician?" The Prescott Unified School District, where Ashford had served on the Health Advisory Board from 2005 to 2015, issued a statement expressing shock and announcing an immediate review of all policies related to community volunteer background checks. Boulder Community Hospital, where Ashford had held admitting privileges for 40 years, conducted an internal review to determine whether there had been any complaints or concerning behavior during his tenure, and found none, a testament to how completely Ashford had compartmentalized his identity as a killer from his professional identity as a physician. The psychological impact on Ashford's former patients was particularly severe. Parents who'd trusted him with their children's health care struggled with feelings of violation and betrayal. Several former patients, now adults, reported experiencing nightmares and anxiety about medical appointments after learning that the doctor who'd given them vaccinations and treated their childhood illnesses had been a murderer. The Boulder County Department of Health established a crisis counseling program specifically to help community members process the trauma of Ashford's arrest, recognizing that the betrayal of trust affected not just individuals, but the community's collective sense of safety and judgment about who deserved trust. Daniel Morgan, Rebecca's younger brother, who Ashford had delivered and treated as a pediatrician through age 18, released a statement through the family's attorney describing his experience of learning that his doctor had been his sister's killer. Every childhood memory I have of going to the doctor now feels contaminated. Dr. Ashford was someone my parents trusted completely, someone I saw for regular checkups and when I was sick. He gave me advice about health and growing up. He attended my high school graduation. All of this was happening while he knew that he'd murdered my sister, that he'd stood beside my father during the search for her body, that he'd lied to my family for my entire life. I don't have words for what that knowledge does to you. The interrogation of William Ashford following his arrest produced no confession, but revealed aspects of his psychology that would become central to understanding how he'd maintained his deception for 4 decades. Ashford invoked his right to legal counsel immediately, retaining Robert Harrison, one of Colorado's most prominent criminal defense attorneys. Harrison advised Ashford not to answer questions about the substance of the charges, but before the interrogation ended, Ashford made several statements that would be used as evidence of consciousness of guilt and narcissistic grandiosity. "I know you have DNA evidence," Ashford told Martinez during the interrogation. "I've been reading about forensic genealogy for years. I knew it was only a matter of time. What I'm curious about is what took you so long. The technology to analyze that hair has existed for at least 5 years. Why did it take until 2023 for someone to actually look at Rebecca's case with fresh eyes?" The question wasn't a confession, but an acknowledgement that he'd been monitoring developments in forensic science and anticipating the possibility of arrest, combined with a kind of arrogance about having evaded detection for so long. When Martinez asked why Ashford had maintained contact with the Morgan family for decades after Rebecca's murder, his response revealed the psychological dynamics that had driven his behavior. "They trusted me. That trust was reassuring. It confirmed that my performance was successful, that I was perceived exactly as I wanted to be perceived. If the people most motivated to find Rebecca's killer accepted me as someone who cared about her memory, then everyone else would too. The relationship with the Morgan family wasn't a risk. It was actually security. No one suspects the person the victim's family has welcomed into their lives." This explanation, delivered in the detached, analytical tone of someone discussing a case study rather than his own crimes, would be analyzed by forensic psychologists who identified it as evidence of narcissistic personality disorder combined with antisocial traits that allowed Ashford to view other people as objects to be manipulated rather than humans with intrinsic value. The fact that Ashford could deliver Margaret Morgan's baby, hold newborn Daniel, and say Rebecca would have loved him, while knowing he'd murdered Rebecca, demonstrated a level of compartmentalization and emotional detachment that experts described as rare even among serial offenders. The trial of William Eugene Ashford began on June 3, 2024, in Boulder County District Court before Judge Patricia Morrison, with a jury pool that had been extensively questioned about their ability to remain impartial despite 44 years of community investment in Rebecca Morgan's case and the shocking nature of revelations about Ashford's involvement. The prosecution's case, led by District Attorney Sarah Morrison, was built on 3 pillars: the DNA evidence conclusively placing Ashford at the crime scene, the journal entries demonstrating ongoing consciousness of guilt and deliberate deception, and testimony about Ashford's systematic insertion into the Morgan family's life as a strategy to deflect suspicion. The DNA evidence was explained by Dr. Jennifer Wallace from Othram, Inc., who walked the jury through the process of extracting mitochondrial DNA from the hair found in Rebecca's hand, generating a genetic profile and comparing it to William Ashford's DNA obtained from the discarded coffee cup. Wallace explained that the probability of the hair belonging to someone other than Ashford or a direct maternal relative was approximately 1 in 8.9 trillion, effectively eliminating any possibility of coincidental match. The defense's attempt to challenge the reliability of mitochondrial DNA analysis was undermined by Wallace's credentials and the fact that this technology had been accepted in hundreds of criminal cases across the United States. The journal entries found in Ashford's office were introduced as evidence of ongoing consciousness of guilt. Dr. Barbara Ray Venner, the forensic genealogist who identified Ashford through DNA analysis, testified about how the journal entries had documented Ashford's awareness that forensic genealogy posed a threat to his freedom. His research into whether Rebecca's case might be reopened using new technology, and his deliberate strategy of maintaining visibility in the Morgan family's life as a form of psychological cover. The defense argued that the journal represented Ashford's personal thoughts and didn't constitute evidence of murder, but the prosecution successfully demonstrated that the entries documented knowledge only Rebecca's killer could possess. The testimony about Ashford's relationship with the Morgan family was delivered by Margaret and Daniel Morgan, both of whom described the decades of trust that had been systematically cultivated and exploited. Margaret's testimony, which lasted 3 hours over 2 days, walked the jury through every interaction she'd had with Ashford from 1979 through 2023. From his volunteer participation in the search for Rebecca to his delivery of Daniel to his regular sympathy cards on October the 31st, he didn't just deceive my family, Margaret told the jury, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. He used our grief as a tool to deflect suspicion, used our trust as a shield to protect himself, and used his access to our lives as confirmation that his performance was successful. That's not just murder. That's 44 years of ongoing psychological torture. Daniel's testimony was particularly powerful because it demonstrated the intergenerational impact of Ashford's crimes. I was born into a world where Rebecca was already gone, Daniel said. My entire childhood was shaped by her absence and my parents' grief, and the person my parents turned to for support, the doctor who delivered me and took care of me for 18 years, was the reason Rebecca was gone in the first place. Dr. Ashford didn't just take my sister's life. He poisoned my entire childhood by inserting himself into my family while carrying the secret of what he'd done. I'll never be able to separate my memories of going to the doctor from the knowledge that those appointments were opportunities for my sister's killer to observe the ongoing impact of his crime. The defense, led by attorney Robert Harrison, attempted to create reasonable doubt by arguing that the DNA evidence proved only that Ashford had been in physical contact with Rebecca at some point, not necessarily during her murder. Harrison suggested that the hair could have been transferred innocently during conversations at the community health clinic, though he struggled to explain why Rebecca would have been clutching Ashford's hair in her closed fist if the contact had been benign. The defense also argued that the journal entries reflected Ashford's anxiety about being falsely accused rather than consciousness of actual guilt. But this argument was undermined by entries that described specific details about maintaining his alibi and deflecting suspicion that only the killer would have reason to document. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by District Attorney Morrison, lasted 2 hours and systematically dismantled every defense theory while reconstructing the full scope of Ashford's crimes over 44 years. William Ashford murdered Rebecca Morgan on October 31st, 1979, Morrison told the jury. That's the crime he's charged with, and the DNA evidence proves it beyond any reasonable doubt. But what he did over the next 44 years represents something even more sinister. He didn't just kill Rebecca and hide her body. He volunteered to search for her, knowing she was dead. He stood beside her father, calling her name, knowing where she was buried. He delivered her brother, knowing he'd murdered her. He sent sympathy cards to her family for 44 years, knowing he was responsible for their grief. He attended memorial services in her honor, knowing he'd stolen her future. This wasn't just a murder. This was a 44-year performance of concern and compassion, designed to deflect suspicion while satisfying his narcissistic need to observe the impact of his crime. William Ashford didn't just kill Rebecca Morgan. He used her death as the foundation for building a life of respect and trust that was nothing but a mask covering unimaginable evil. The guilty verdict came on July 18, 2024, after 14 hours of deliberation spread across 3 days. When the jury foreman read the decision, Ashford showed no visible emotion, maintaining the same composed demeanor he'd displayed throughout the trial. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later brought closure that had been delayed for 44 years. Judge Morrison, before pronouncing sentence, addressed Ashford directly in remarks that would be widely quoted in news coverage. Dr. Ashford, you violated every principle of the medical profession you claim to honor. You took an oath to do no harm, and then you murdered a 17-year-old girl. You violated the trust of thousands of families who believed you cared about their children's welfare. Most despicably, you violated the trust of the Morgan family, inserting yourself into their lives and using their grief as a tool to deflect suspicion from yourself. The law allows me to sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, and I do so with the understanding that you'll die in prison as you should. Rebecca Morgan was 17 years old when you murdered her. She deserved to live a full life, to pursue her dreams of environmental science, to become the person her intelligence and passion promised she would be. You took that from her family, and from the community she would have contributed to. That's a loss that can never be repaired, only acknowledged and honored by ensuring you never walk free again. Thomas Morgan had passed away in 2021, 2 years before Ashford's arrest, his final years consumed by declining health and the same unanswered questions that had haunted him since 1979. Margaret Morgan, now 79 and in fragile health, attended the sentencing in a wheelchair, surrounded by Daniel and other family members. When offered the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement, Margaret spoke for 20 minutes, her voice gaining strength as she addressed not just Ashford, but the broader implications of his decades of deception. "You delivered my son," Margaret said, looking directly at Ashford. "You held him minutes after he was born and told me Rebecca would have loved him. I treasured those words for 37 years, repeated them to Daniel when he asked about the sister he'd never met, and believed they showed how much you cared about honoring Rebecca's memory. Now I know they were the words of someone who took satisfaction in his ability to deceive us, who enjoyed inserting himself into the most intimate moment of our family's life while carrying the secret of what he'd done to Rebecca. That's evil that goes beyond the murder itself. That's cruelty that spans 44 years. You didn't just kill my daughter. You contaminated every memory we built after her death by making yourself part of our lives." She paused, composing herself. "But I want you to know something, William. You failed. You thought you'd gotten away with it, thought you were clever enough and careful enough that you'd never face consequences. You built a life of respect and trust, and it was all a lie. Everyone knows now. Every patient you ever treated, every family you examined, every person in Boulder who trusted you now knows what you are. Your reputation is destroyed. Your legacy is nothing but horror. You'll die in prison, and when you do, no one will mourn you. No one will remember you as a respected pediatrician. They'll remember you only as the man who murdered Rebecca Morgan and had the audacity to pretend to care about her memory while delivering her brother and attending her memorial services. That's your legacy. That's all you'll ever be. And Rebecca's legacy is stronger than ever. The scholarship in her name continues supporting young environmental scientists. Her story inspires people who work to solve cold cases. She's remembered with love and respect. You'll be remembered with nothing but revulsion. In that sense, she won. William Ashford died in the Colorado State Penitentiary in Canyon City on March 14, 2025, just 8 months after beginning his life sentence. The cause of death was officially listed as complications from pneumonia, though prison medical staff noted he declined treatment and appeared to have lost the will to live following his conviction. He never provided additional details about Rebecca's murder, never explained his decision-making process in targeting her, and never expressed remorse for either killing her or the 44 years of deception that followed. His death closed the case legally, but left questions about his psychology and motivations that would never be fully answered. Eleanor Ashford filed for divorce 2 weeks after her husband's arrest and released a statement through her attorney expressing her devastation at learning she'd been married to a murderer for 45 years and had unknowingly provided him an alibi that helped him evade justice. She moved to Oregon to live with her daughter and changed her name to distance herself from association with William's crimes. The Ashford house on Mapleton Avenue was sold in early 2025, with proceeds going toward restitution to the Morgan family, though no amount of money could compensate for 44 years of stolen peace. Margaret Morgan passed away peacefully on November 1st, 2025, exactly 46 years after Rebecca's disappearance. She had lived long enough to see her daughter's killer convicted and imprisoned, long enough to participate in a memorial service where Boulder officially renamed a section of the Roosevelt National Forest as the Rebecca Morgan Memorial Wilderness Area, and long enough to know that her family's decades of advocacy had helped inspire improvements in cold case investigation that would help solve other families' mysteries. Her obituary in the Boulder Daily Camera described her not just as Rebecca's mother, but as an advocate whose determination had helped ensure that advancing forensic science was applied to unsolved cases, and whose grace in the face of unimaginable betrayal had exemplified the strength required to survive not just loss, but the revelation that the person you trusted to help you grieve had been responsible for your grief all along. For Detective Rachel Martinez, the Rebecca Morgan case became both a career-defining success and a cautionary reminder about how professional credentials and community standing can mask unimaginable evil. She continued working cold cases, solving 3 more murders in the 2 years following Ashford's conviction, always carrying with her the lessons learned from a case where the killer had hidden, not in shadows, but in plain sight, where trust had been weaponized as a tool of deception, and where justice had arrived 44 years late but had arrived nonetheless, giving voice to a victim who died clutching evidence that would eventually expose her killer and shatter the facade he'd spent nearly half a century constructing.